First story, The Scarecrow of Yellow Oaks. I moved to Yellow Oaks, Illinois, at the start of fall, lured by the promise of a quieter life. The town had a welcoming, almost quaint vibe, with pumpkin patches, hayrides, and decorations in every storefront. My neighbors were friendly enough, eager to pull me into the town's traditions, especially the annual Fall Festival, which would start in October. The centerpiece of this festival was a towering scarecrow, built from scratch each year by the locals. The scarecrow was a symbol, they explained, a kind of guardian of the town. Despite how odd it seemed, I agreed to help, mostly out of curiosity. The townsfolk gathered materials: straw, burlap, an old pair of boots, a hat, and a ratty shirt that must have been decades old. "Tradition is tradition," one of the older men said, with a tone that felt oddly final. As we built it, there was an odd sense of reverence in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around me was whispering as they worked, barely looking at each other, eyes fixed on the scarecrow like it was more than a pile of straw and cloth. And I swear, even while stuffing straw into its frame, I felt like something was watching me. When we finished, the scarecrow towered over the square, its burlap face hollow but somehow menacing. The townspeople clapped and cheered, but I couldn't help noticing how quickly they dispersed afterward, leaving me alone with it. The day ended, and everyone went back to their routines, as if nothing unusual had happened. But a few days later, I started noticing changes. The scarecrow, which we'd carefully positioned facing south, appeared to be turned slightly west the next morning. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. At first, I thought maybe the wind had shifted it. But the following night, it moved again, this time a few feet to the left, as if it had taken a few small steps across the square. I told my neighbor, Margaret, about it, hoping to get some confirmation that this wasn't just in my head. She only chuckled and patted my shoulder. "The scarecrow's just doing its job, Jake," she said cryptically. "It'll settle down by the end of the festival." Her words rattled me. What did she mean, doing its job? And how could anyone explain it moving on its own? Over the next week, things escalated. I'd come home to find bits of straw on my porch and muddy footprints leading from the square right to my door. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially at night, and every time I glanced out my window, I'd swear the scarecrow had inched closer. I started locking my doors and leaving lights on through the night, but somehow that only seemed to make things worse. Finally, I decided to put an end to it. I set up a small camera across from the square, determined to catch whatever prankster was behind this. I stayed up that night, watching the footage on my laptop, hour after hour of nothing but darkness and the faint shape of the scarecrow. Then, around 3 a.m., my blood ran cold. In the dim glow of the streetlight, the scarecrow shifted, first its head, then its arms. Its head lifted slightly, turning toward my camera, as if it knew I was watching. Its legs dragged forward, one heavy step at a time, its straw-stuffed body shifting unnaturally, almost rhythmically, in the direction of my house. Heart pounding, I slammed my laptop shut and bolted the door. The footsteps outside grew louder, a slow, dragging sound, straw brushing against the pavement. I fumbled with my phone to call the police, but as I glanced out my front window, the scarecrow was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a trail of muddy footprints led from the square directly to my porch. I barely slept, listening to every creak, every rustle of straw that night. By morning, the scarecrow was back in its place in the town square, positioned as if it had never moved, its empty burlap face blank and lifeless. The last day of the festival was a blur. The townsfolk seemed to carry on like nothing had happened, as if I were the only one who'd seen it move, who'd heard it outside my door. Desperate, I confronted Margaret, demanding to know what was really going on. Her expression hardened. "Jake, the scarecrow protects this town. It does what it has to," she said, her eyes cold and unmoving. "It only bothers those who don't belong." I packed that night, ready to leave town and its cursed scarecrow behind me. But as I reached my car, I saw it again. Standing at the edge of my yard, straw arms outstretched as if in a mocking embrace. I turned to run, but the last thing I remember was the sound of straw rustling and a cold, rough grip around my arm. They found my car the next day, empty, my belongings scattered as if I'd left in a hurry. The townsfolk shrugged it off, calling it a disappearance. But in the town square, a faint red stain had appeared on the scarecrow's straw chest, darkening as the days went on. And each fall, the scarecrow returned, standing silently in the square, as if waiting for its next unwelcome visitor. Second story. I rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods of Maine, driven by the promise of capturing fall's vivid reds and golds. As a wildlife photographer, I live for isolation and for chasing those elusive shots that most people only see in nature magazines. The trip was supposed to be an escape from city life, a way to reconnect with the wilderness. The cabin was a tiny thing, tucked between towering pines and maples, their leaves shifting from orange to red as the season hit its peak. It was charming, rustic. The nearest town, a barely there speck called Eddington, was about 20 miles away, which suited me just fine. Cell signal was spotty, but I hadn't planned on needing it. I came out here to work. The first 2 days went by uneventfully. I'd hike out each morning, camera in hand, capturing the sunlight as it filtered through the leaves, or waiting in silence, hoping for a deer to wander into view. I would upload my shots each evening to my laptop, reliving the day through each captured frame. On the third day, things began to shift. I noticed something in one of my photos, a shadow that didn't belong. It was taken late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting. There, among the trunks of the trees, stood a dark shape, partially hidden. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the outline was vaguely human, blurry, distant. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even a strange growth on one of the trees, and tried to forget about it. But then it happened again, and again. The shadow appeared in several of my photos from that day, each time in a slightly different spot, as though whatever it was had been following me. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the day in my head, convincing myself it was paranoia. I listened to the creaks and groans of the old cabin, telling myself that old would always sound strange, that I was alone. The next morning, on my fourth day, I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. When I returned to the cabin that evening and uploaded my photos, my stomach sank. The shadow was closer and clearer, unmistakably a figure now. Just out of focus, it stood among the trees, half obscured but unmistakably watching me. I zoomed in on one particular image, my heart pounding. The figure's head seemed to be tilted, like it was studying me too. Steeling myself, I went outside with a flashlight to check the cabin's perimeter. I wish I hadn't. Fresh, muddy footprints circled the cabin. My breath hitched when I saw the strange markings carved into several of the trees nearby, a crude shape that looked like an eye and a spiral surrounding it. They didn't look like any wildlife signs I'd ever seen. Shaken, I locked myself in the cabin. The wind picked up, and I could hear it whistle through the trees, rattling against the windows, a low and constant sound that made the cabin feel smaller and more fragile. I thought about calling someone, but I felt foolish. Who would I even call? And what would I say? I barely slept that night, and by morning, I knew I had to leave. But the moment I stepped outside, the forest itself seemed off. The trail I'd been using was gone, or maybe it was just that the forest seemed to have shifted somehow, closing in around me. Trees loomed tall, casting thick shadows, making it hard to get my bearings. I circled back to the cabin, panic rising. It was like something was guiding me back, trapping me. As the evening crept in, a thick fog blanketed the ground, muffling every sound. In the silence, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and measured, circling the cabin. I peered out the window, but all I could see were vague shapes in the mist, moving between the trees. They were no longer just shadows in my photos. They were here, surrounding me. I couldn't wait until morning. Grabbing only my camera, I bolted out the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at my clothes, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. The shapes in the fog seemed to follow, always just on the edges of my vision, like they were herding me somewhere deeper into the woods. I don't know how long I ran, or when I lost my sense of direction completely. The world became a blur of trees and fog and movement. At some point, I tripped, and everything went black. They found me 3 days later, wandering near the main road, covered in scratches, muttering incoherently. I barely remember any of it. My camera was gone, my laptop wiped clean. All the photos I'd taken, every single one, gone. But there are moments, flashes in my mind, memories I can't quite shake. Shadows moving through the fog, an eye carved into trees, footsteps crunching in the silence, closer and closer. But the photos, the only evidence, were gone. And everyone says I just got lost, that I imagined it all. Third story, The Whisper on Leaf Road. There's a place back home in Pennsylvania that everyone knows about, but no one really talks about. It's called Leaf Road, a narrow, winding lane hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees that crowd out the light even in the middle of the day. Growing up, my little brother, Daniel, and I were always fascinated by the stories about it. The whispers, the shadows that seemed to follow you, the people who'd supposedly vanished there without a trace. Every October, someone would retell the same chilling stories, and every October, Daniel and I would wonder if any of them were real. This past Halloween, Daniel decided he wanted to prove it was all just superstition, that the stories were nothing more than ghost tales. He convinced me to join him, and before I knew it, we were standing at the mouth of Leaf Road, the trees twisting above us like skeletal fingers. "Are you ready?" he asked, grinning, clearly more excited than I was. I tried to hide my nerves and nodded, grabbing my flashlight and stepping into the darkness with him. The night was unusually quiet as we started down the road, our footsteps crunching on fallen leaves that carpeted the ground. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rust. Every now and then, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, just shadows cast by the trees, I told myself. Halfway down the road, our phones lost signal, the bars dropping to nothing in a single blink. I tried calling out to Daniel, but my voice sounded too loud, almost swallowed up by the silence around us. I laughed, trying to break the tension. "See? Nothing but trees and shadows. All those stories are just stories, Daniel." But he didn't answer me. He was staring off into the darkness, his face a shade paler than usual. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the sound of our own breathing, shallow and quick. "Hear what?" "There," he said, pointing into the trees. I couldn't hear anything, but Daniel's face was serious. "Someone's calling my name. Meg." I forced a laugh, but it came out sounding hollow. "Come on. Daniel, you're just getting spooked. There's nobody out here but us." But his eyes remained fixed on something in the distance, something I couldn't see. "They're calling me," he insisted, voice growing softer, almost dazed. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back toward the road. "Stop it, okay? This isn't funny." But Daniel pulled away, his eyes fixed on the darkness as the whispering began. Soft at first, like the rustle of wind through leaves, but then growing louder, a low, hissing murmur that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Daniel," the sound wrapped around us, slipping into the spaces between the trees and echoing down the road like a chant. I wanted to run, but Daniel seemed rooted in place, his face blank and almost entranced. "Daniel, please," I begged, my voice breaking. "We have to go." But he wouldn't listen. He took a step toward the trees, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Daniel, come to us. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off, his eyes distant, as if he was seeing something beyond the trees, something pulling him deeper into the darkness. "Daniel!" I screamed, but he walked forward, disappearing between the trees as if drawn by some invisible thread. I ran after him, stumbling over roots and branches, my flashlight bobbing in the darkness, casting strange, twisted shadows. I chased him until I couldn't run anymore, my legs burning and lungs aching. I kept calling his name, hoping he'd answer, but the only response was the whispering, growing louder, filling the air around me. When I finally stopped, I realized I was completely alone. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around, trying to find any sign of him, but there was nothing, just darkness and the endless rustling of leaves. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was standing on the side of Leaf Road, my flashlight dead in my hand, dirt and leaves clinging to my clothes. People were shouting my name, and then there were hands on my shoulders, leading me back to the road. The police searched the woods for days, combing every inch of Leaf Road, but they found no trace of Daniel. Nothing except for his favorite baseball cap, hanging from a low branch just a few yards from where I'd last seen him. I tried to explain what had happened, but I could see the doubt in everyone's eyes. They all thought I was just traumatized, that I'd imagined it. But I know what I heard. Now, every October, people say they hear the same whispers echoing down Leaf Road, calling a name that sounds eerily familiar. Some say it's just the wind. Others swear they've seen shadows slipping between the trees. And every year, when the leaves start to fall, I can still hear it too. The faint, haunting echo of my brother's name, carried on the cold autumn air. Fourth story, the house with the cracked mirror. We moved into the Moore house in early September, right as the leaves were beginning to turn in upstate New York. The house itself was breathtaking, a sprawling Victorian manor nestled on a quiet hill surrounded by trees. Every room seemed to carry a story, filled with antique furniture and a peculiar sense of stillness, as though the walls were holding their breath. But one piece of furniture stood out, a tall, cracked mirror at the end of the main hallway. It was beautiful in an eerie way, with an ornate, weathered frame that hinted at another era. But something about it made me uncomfortable. The crack ran down the center, splitting it like a jagged scar, and no matter the angle, there always seemed to be a faint shadow lingering in its reflection, just out of focus. I brushed it off as a trick of the light. Houses like this had a way of making shadows dance. The first time I noticed something odd was 2 weeks after we moved in. I was up late, unpacking boxes while everyone else was asleep. As I passed by the mirror, a flicker caught my eye. I stopped, staring, convinced I'd seen something move in its depths. The room behind me was dark, and for a moment, I thought I saw the outline of a figure. A tall, dark silhouette, almost like a person, but distorted by the crack running down the glass. From then on, every time I passed that mirror, I felt a chill, like something was watching. I mentioned it to my husband, Jack, who laughed it off, blaming it on stress from the move. But even he started avoiding the hallway at night, walking around the long way to get to the kitchen. By mid-October, the activity in the house began to intensify. I would hear footsteps on the stairs late at night, the soft creak of the floorboards as if someone was pacing back and forth on the upper floor. Doors would swing open by themselves, sometimes slamming shut with a force that shook the walls. My children, Ellie and Sam, would wake up with nightmares, claiming they'd heard whispers in their rooms. The shadows in the mirror seemed to deepen, almost becoming part of the room itself, like the mirror was a window to somewhere else entirely. One night, as I was heading to bed, I passed the mirror and froze. There it was, clearer than ever. A tall figure, its head bowed and limbs too long, its form twisted by the crack. It seemed closer this time, pressing up against the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out to touch the mirror, feeling a strange, bone-deep chill seep through me. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I started searching for anyone who might know more about the mirror's origin, and after several dead ends, I finally found a local antiques dealer who specialized in unusual pieces. When he arrived, his expression changed the moment he saw the mirror. He ran a hand over the crack, his face growing pale as he explained that mirrors like these were sometimes used in rituals, as windows or containers to trap spirits. "It's not just cracked," he said, his voice low. "It's fractured. Whatever was bound here, it's starting to seep out." I couldn't bring myself to smash the mirror, but I took his advice and covered it with a thick cloth, determined to keep whatever was in there from escaping. For a few days, the house felt lighter. The footsteps ceased, the doors stayed closed, and the shadows stopped moving. I started to believe that we'd put an end to whatever presence lurked in that mirror. But exactly 1 week later, the cloth was gone. I found it folded neatly on the floor beneath the mirror, which stood uncovered, the crack somehow wider and deeper, a jagged wound in the glass. The figure in the mirror was closer now, its dark shape looming as if it had pressed itself up against the very edge of the glass, waiting. That was the last straw. Within days, we packed our things and left the Moore house behind. It was a relief to lock the door one final time, leaving that haunted place and its cracked mirror for good, or so we thought. 2 weeks after we settled into our new house, as I was unpacking the last of our boxes, I opened the closet to find the mirror. My heart stopped. It was the same cracked glass, the same weathered frame, sitting there as if it had followed us across miles. And in the reflection, I saw that shadow, clearer than ever, pressed against the glass with a cold, knowing stare, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Fifth story. The Man from the Fall Fair. It was the fall fair in my little town in Vermont, the kind of event that brought everyone out, the whole community, families, kids running around, pumpkin patches, hay rides, and my favorite, the carousel. The fair had always been a big deal, and that year I landed a job working a few of the booths. It wasn't much, but the extra cash was worth the long nights under the chilly autumn sky. The first time I noticed him was on my second night working. I was running the popcorn stand, and there was this man, tall, dressed in an old, dark coat, with a hat pulled low over his face, just standing by the carousel. He was watching, but not the way parents watch their kids. He seemed focused on something, staring almost right through the carousel, as if there was something only he could see. But it was his stillness that caught my attention. While everyone around him laughed, talked, and moved, he just stood there, absolutely unmoving, hands in his pockets, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat. I thought maybe he was a fair worker or just some eccentric local. But as soon as I looked away and back again, he was gone. The next night, I was in the same spot, and there he was again, standing by the carousel, the same coat, the same dark hat, and that same unsettling stillness. This time, I decided to approach him, a little curious, maybe a little spooked. But as I weaved my way through the crowd, he melted into the shadows. It was almost like he'd vanished, slipping out of view just as I reached the edge of the carousel. After a few nights of this, I started asking around. I described the man to my coworkers. Tall, dark coat, worn hat, always near the carousel. But nobody knew who I was talking about. A few just shrugged, but one older worker, Hank, looked at me with something close to pity. "Probably just one of the town's ghosts," he chuckled. "This fair's been here long enough to have a few." I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Hank wasn't entirely joking. By the last night of the fair, I was both relieved and on edge. I'd barely seen the man again, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of that coat or the shadow of that hat just out of the corner of my eye. It was almost like he was slipping between the crowd, never fully in view, but close enough that I knew he was still there, watching. As I finished my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I left the fairground and started down the winding path home. That's when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, matching my pace, stopping whenever I did. My heart was pounding, and I glanced over my shoulder. half expecting to see the usual empty street. But there he was, the man in the hat and coat, standing beneath a flickering street lamp, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, yet close enough that the dark mass of his figure felt imposing. I was too scared to say anything, but too proud to run, so I picked up my pace. But so did he. Felt like a nightmare, one where you're moving but never fast enough. I took turns down side streets, slipping through alleys, but every time I looked back, he was there, keeping that same haunting distance. Finally, when I was almost home, I turned around and shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" He took a step forward, and as he stepped into the faint glow of the streetlight, I saw his face, or rather, the absence of it. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was only darkness, a hollow, endless void like the shadowy interior of an empty room. I stumbled back, my stomach turning, and I ran, sprinting the last stretch to my front door. I didn't stop until I was inside, every door and window locked tight. The next morning, I stepped outside, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But there, hanging off the fence at the edge of my yard, was his coat, dark and heavy, swaying in the wind. My heart sank, and I felt a chill I couldn't shake. Since that night, I've seen him everywhere. I'll be on my way to school, at the store, in the back of a crowded theater, and he'll be there, watching me from the corner of my eye, never coming closer, but never going away. No one else seems to notice him. I don't know what he is or why he follows me, but I know this much. Once he finds you, he never leaves. 6th story, The Raven's Call. When I inherited the farmhouse just outside Salem, Massachusetts, I saw it as a blessing. A quaint, albeit abandoned, colonial house on a few acres of land was the perfect spot for a history professor on fall break. I'd been fascinated by Salem's history for as long as I could remember, so the thought of owning a piece of land with a past excited me. I packed up my car, thinking I'd spend a few peaceful weeks there, catching up on research and grading papers. The house was more weathered than I'd expected. Ivy crawled up the crumbling stone walls, and the shutters hung crooked, creaking with every gust of wind. As I approached, I noticed a raven perched on the rusty old gate. Its black eyes followed my every step, unblinking. I shrugged it off as a quirky part of country life, unlocked the gate, and stepped into the overgrown yard. But the bird didn't move. It just watched like it was assessing me, deciding something. That night, I settled into the old study. The house was drafty, with walls that groaned against the chill wind, but it had a charm that was strangely comforting. Every time I glanced out the window, though, I'd catch sight of that raven. It stayed near the house, perched on different spots, the fence, the window ledge, and once even on the porch railing. It seemed almost patient, like it was waiting for me to do something. Over the next few days, the bird became a constant presence. No matter where I went on the property, it followed, either hopping along behind me or swooping ahead, its wings silent. I started calling it my shadow as a joke, trying to ease the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. But I couldn't ignore the patterns. It led me day after day to specific parts of the house. First to the attic, then to the cellar, places I hadn't even planned on exploring. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the attic, I found an old wooden chest tucked into a dark corner, almost invisible under layers of dust. The raven was perched on a rafter, watching. Inside the chest, I found bundles of letters, yellowed with age, written in a beautiful but spidery script. They were addressed to a Mary C., from someone only signing their name as E. Each letter had cryptic references to keeping the balance, protecting the legacy, and mentions of hooded gatherings at the altar. My heart pounded as I read on, unable to shake the feeling that these weren't just ordinary letters. They spoke of rituals, of summoning, and of a pact made long ago to bind the spirit to the land. The final letter mentioned a clearing near the house and warned Mary to visit every autumn, to offer respect to the guardian. That night, I woke to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. The raven sat there, silhouetted against the moonlight, its beady eyes fixed on me, unblinking. And then, as the wind howled around the house, I swore I heard it. My name, whispered on the breeze, faint but unmistakable. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the raven tilted its head, almost as if it understood, before it flew off into the woods. I barely slept. At dawn, I found myself pulled toward the edge of the property, where an old path twisted into the dense forest. The raven awaited me there, cawing softly as it hopped ahead, leading me through the trees until we reached a small clearing. At the center was a stone slab, weathered and cracked, but unmistakably an altar. The air grew colder, heavy with a silence that felt watchful. The raven perched on the altar, its eyes fixed on mine. I felt a strange pull, like something wanted me to come closer, to touch the stone. My head felt foggy, my limbs heavy. It was as though the whispers from the letters, the voices in the wind, were all merging, calling me to complete some unfinished task. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the altar, my hand brushing against the cold stone. My vision swam, and the world seemed to tilt. The last thing I remember was the raven's shadow stretching over me, its shape shifting, almost human, and the softest whisper of my name in a voice that was not my own. I woke in a hospital days later, found by hikers who had stumbled onto my unconscious body in the clearing. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even bring myself to write. I tried to explain, but nothing would come out. It was as if the words had been taken from me. My memories felt fractured, jumbled, but I knew one thing. I could still hear the raven's call echoing in my mind. They eventually placed me in a psychiatric facility, where I've spent every autumn since. The doctors say it's trauma, a kind of fugue state, but I know better. Every October, I feel the raven's pull, that cold whisper beckoning me back to the altar. And each year, someone reports seeing a raven perched there, guarding it, waiting. Somehow, I know it's waiting for me to return. Seventh story, the voices in the cornfield. It was supposed to be just a quick drive through Indiana on my way to visit my friends in Chicago. I was halfway there, driving along a lonely stretch of road flanked by endless fields of corn, when my car gave a sudden, jerking lurch and died. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, glancing around in frustration and a bit of unease. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows over the field beside me. I dialed the nearest mechanic listed on my phone, and after a few gruff words, he told me he'd be out first thing in the morning, but not before. "Nothing out here at night," he said with a strange pause, like he wanted to say something else but held back. I didn't like the idea of spending the night alone on that dark, empty road, but I didn't have much choice. As darkness crept over the landscape, I settled in, trying to convince myself I'd just sleep and be gone at dawn. But as soon as the last trace of light disappeared, a different kind of silence set in. The kind that presses in on you, thick and expectant. I tried playing music on my phone to break it up, but then I heard it, soft, barely audible through the closed windows. A murmur, like someone whispering just beyond the reach of the headlights. I paused the music and listened. It came again, a strange, shuffling whisper floating from the cornfield. I thought maybe it was the wind rustling the stalks, but this was different. It almost sounded like voices, multiple voices, hushed and disjointed, as if they were whispering secrets just out of reach. I shook my head, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine, but the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the corn itself was speaking, shifting and sighing, until I could almost make out words. A low, chilling murmur, faint but distinct, calling my name. I locked the doors, my eyes scanning the field, watching as the tall stalks swayed gently under the moonlight. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but something about the sound felt real, deliberate. I hunched down in my seat, hoping to block out the noises, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, an overwhelming sense that someone or something was watching me from within the darkness of the cornfield. The hours crept by, each one dragging slower than the last. Around midnight, the whispers quieted, and I almost let myself believe it was over. But then I saw it, a figure, just a shadow at first, moving slowly between the rows of corn, barely visible under the dim moonlight. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal, but the figure grew closer, slowly emerging from the field, step by step. It was a person, or at least shaped like one, its form blurred and indistinct, as though it was slipping in and out of reality. The figure stopped just at the edge of the cornfield, standing perfectly still, facing my car. I couldn't make out a face, only the outline of a head, shoulders, and the unnatural stillness that seemed to radiate from it. My heart raced as the figure took a single step forward, then another, pausing each time, as if savoring the fear I could feel pouring from me. Without thinking, I ducked down, sinking low into the seat, clutching the door handle as if it would somehow keep me safe. Minutes passed, and I didn't dare look. The whispers began again, louder now, almost pleading, like a dozen voices all speaking at once. I squeezed my eyes shut, blocking out everything, hoping whatever it was would go away. Then came the sound I dreaded most, a light tapping on the window. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to look to see who or what was there, but terror held me in place. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. Somehow, I found the courage to lift my head, just enough to glance out of the corner of my eye. There was no one there. The tapping stopped, replaced by the low hum of whispers that seemed to surround the car, filling the night with a cacophony of voices. I don't know how I made it through the night. Every shadow, every sound set my nerves on edge. I barely breathed, barely moved, convinced that at any moment, something would pull me out of the car and into the cornfield. When dawn finally broke, I felt a strange, almost overwhelming relief as the golden light poured over the fields. The whispers faded, the air grew still, and it was as if the night itself had never happened. But I knew better. I waited until the mechanic arrived, and as he checked my car, I glanced over toward the cornfield, expecting to see, I don't know, signs of what had been there, but all I saw were rows of corn, swaying peacefully in the breeze. The mechanic must have seen the terror on my face because he asked if I was okay. I tried to explain, tried to tell him about the voices and the figure, but he only shook his head. "You're not the first," he muttered, almost to himself. "Something about that field. People hear things, see things, but nobody really knows what it is." Later, the police investigated but found nothing. Just a few stray footprints, leading from the road into the depths of the field. I drove away, grateful to leave that cursed road behind, but haunted by the whispers I could still hear echoing in my mind. Months later, I read about other drivers who had disappeared along that same stretch of road. Their cars were found abandoned, doors wide open, but no sign of the people themselves. Now, every time I pass a cornfield, I swear I hear it again. A faint, haunting whisper, as if the field itself remembers.